everybody. Greetings from Clasheen. I'm delighted to welcome you to this live stream this evening, and I'm happy to answer your Nuno Felting questions. But if you're watching this on the replay, please just drop me a comment later on and I will get back to you with an answer if possible. So it would be really nice to know where you're tuning in from. Feel free to drop a comment and I can flash some of your regions up on the screen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicola Brown. I'm a textile artist living and working in rural Ireland. I'm developing a sustainable textile practice, and my big loves are wet felting and eco printing, two techniques that combine absolutely wonderfully together. So if you do have a question while I'm chatting, I would ask you, please, when you drop it in the comments, if you add a few question marks at the beginning of your question and at the end of your question. I'm monitoring the chat facility by myself today, so it's just really helpful for me to see your questions coming up if there are question marks. So already we have Connecticut in the house, south of England, we have Toronto, and I'm here in Ireland. So the first thing I would like to chat about is what exactly is Nuno Felt and how does it differ from regular felt? And I've selected some questions that have come in response to the long form step-by-step video tutorial that I uploaded to YouTube last week. So the questions that I'm actually throwing up on the screen and answering myself to start with, these are in response to questions I have been getting asked during the week. So I suppose the first thing to ask is, what is wet felting? What is wet felt? So felt is non-woven fabric. It's the oldest known man-made fabric, and usually it's made from animal fiber, and the predominant fiber would be wool, but also from camel hair, mohair, yak, cashmere, alpaca, llama. But wool would be the best known fiber that is used for wet felting, and it's probably what many of you use on a regular basis if you are felt makers. So when you're making wet felt, as opposed to Nuno Felt, with wet felt, you are laying out usually 2 or more layers of fiber. You're pulling tufts of the wool fiber, and in general, most wet felt consists of different layers, and each layer of fiber is at right angles to the other. So if you lay your first layer in this direction, the second layer of fiber goes at right angles to that. And good quality felt is comprised of thin, fine layers of fiber rather than big, thick layers of fiber. And we use soap and water to wet out this wool fiber and to flatten it down, and agitation from our hands to work the fibers, and they start to tangle together, and eventually they shrink and they form a non-woven fabric. So in simplistic terms, felt is non-woven fabric. It's made from animal fiber. It may have embellishing fibers which add highlights to the surface, or it can just be plain fiber. But what is Nuno Felt, and what is the big difference between Nuno Felt and regular felt? Well, the biggest difference is that Nuno Felt comprises of a very high percentage of fabric, and I'll discuss the different fabrics you can try using in a minute. So it's a very high percentage of fabric with a very low percentage of fiber. So regular felt is 2 or more layers of fiber. Nuno Felt is usually 1 fine layer of fiber. It might even be an uneven layer, or it could be laid out in a design, but a very, very fine layer of fiber and a higher percentage of fabric. So that's the big difference. And you might be asking yourself, you know, how did this come to the forefront? Who pioneered this as a technique? So in fact, an American felt maker Polly Sterling, sister of Robin. She lives in Australia, and she and her Japanese studio assistant, now I hope I can pronounce this correctly, Sashiko Kataka, and apologies if my pronunciation isn't good. Polly was wondering, she's a wonderful felt maker, and she was wondering how she could make wearable felt for the very hot climate that she had moved to in Australia. And she developed the technique where she would use fabric with just a small bit of wool. The wool would migrate through the fabric, the wool would shrink, and then the fabric would ruche up beautifully. And she's the person who really brought Nuno Felt to the forefront. And because she was working with a Japanese studio assistant, they were debating what they would call this technique. Some people may have heard of it called laminate felting, but Nuno is it's the Japanese word for fabric, and that is why they decided that they would call the technique of combining a lot of fabric with very little wool Nuno felting. So you may be asking yourself then, which fabric actually works very well for Nuno felting? And I have a couple of personal favorites, but if you're new to Nuno felting, the first thing I would say is my step-by-step tutorial, my long-form tutorial, will take you through the full process from start to finish. It's not been sped up in any way. It's a long video, but if you want to see me felting a silk square and doing it from start to finish, have a look at that. So I have silk as one of my top favorite fabrics to Nuno Felt with. It's the fabric that I usually choose to use for Nuno felting, but I'm also extremely fond of cotton gauze or any form of open weave cotton. Now, when you're selecting silk, which is my top recommendation for a felter new to Nuno felting, I would go for something like a pongé or a habitai that's a 5 momme. The lower the momme, the easier it is for the wool fiber to migrate through the fabric. But anything less than 5 momme, and you don't really see the beautiful puckering as clearly as you do with 5 momme and upwards. Anything up to 8 momme is easy to Nuno Felt with, but of course it's possible to Nuno Felt with higher momme. But the tighter the weave and the heavier the fabric, the more difficult it is for the wool fiber to migrate through. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process in a minute, but just bear that in mind. And I recommend something like a habitai or a pongé 5. But what happens if you don't want to work with silk, or you don't have easy access to silk? Well, cotton gauze, or what in Ireland we use as cheesecloth. It's a very open cotton with quite an open weave. You can see through the little holes in it. That's very beautiful to felt with as well, but it doesn't give you the texture that silk will. And Indian Sikhs, the men wear beautiful turbans, and on their turban is basically made from a cotton. It's a very lightweight cotton, and that also is beautiful when it's felted. Again, you don't get much texture, but you get a beautiful light and flexible piece of fabric. So we have a question here about how do you spell momme. So it's actually, I'm going to post it as a comment. It's M-O-M-M-E, and I'm posting that as a comment, and I'm not sure, yeah, it's gone up into the comment section there. Maybe I will be able to bring it up on the screen. Let me just see here. So this is how you spell it. So M-O-M-M-E is momme. It's a weight or a thread count per meter with silk, and anything from about 5 to 8 momme is perfect as a beginner to get beautiful texture and also to make it not too hard on yourself. So as an experienced Nuno felter, there are very few fabrics that you can't use. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is the calmer you are at the beginning and the more gentle you are at the beginning of the felting process, the more likely it is that your wool fiber will migrate successfully through your fabric. So if you're working with a fabric that might be more difficult, you need to take a lot of time at the beginning, rubbing and rolling before the tips of the fiber migrate up through or down, depending on how you've laid it out, through the fabric. And it's only when the tips of those fibers go through and the wool starts to shrink that you really see the beautiful effect of Nuno Felt. But when I started, I wanted to experiment with all sorts of different fabrics. And in Ireland, many people are very interested in Irish dancing. And in one of the bigger towns, about 30 miles from where I live in the country, there was a shop that specialized in incredible fabric, including Irish dancing fabric. The people made Irish dancing, bespoke Irish dancing costumes. So I bought a whole load of fabric there and I tried Nuno felting with it. So some of it was just artificial fabric. It doesn't have to be linen or silk or cotton or a wool gauze. You can felt with anything. So if you go into somewhere like Joann's or Michael's or any of the stores that do kind of fun fabrics at different times of the year. For example, at Halloween, I got black fabric before, lace fabric, and it had silver spider webs and spiders on it. And it was really funky when it was felted. But if the fabric is not natural, it usually doesn't feel very nice to wear. And for me, the beauty about Nuno Felt is the fact that it's light, it's soft, it's flexible, and it's wearable. So for me, I like working with natural fabrics, but don't let that stop you trying other fabrics as well. So by all means, try artificial ones, but just be aware they may not feel as nice on your skin as the natural fabrics do. So once you've got your fabric selected, you might be asking yourself what fiber you're going to use. And because for me, I choose Nuno Felt when I want to wear something soft and light and flexible against my body. I like to work with merino, and my particular favorite is actually a short fiber merino, and it's very, very soft. It's a 19.5 micron, and the micron count, the lower the count, the finer the wool is. So I like to work with anything between sort of 19 and 20 microns for my Nuno Felt. I have gone up as high as 23 micron, but I have to say I found that a little bit more itchy against my skin, but that's a personal choice. Now, there's nothing to stop you using significantly coarser wool, and you will get some really, really interesting effects. So maybe you might like to make a Nuno Felt curtain, for example, or a really interesting installation or a wall piece. By all means, use coarser, hairier wool, use tougher fabric, but don't expect it to feel so beautiful against your skin as merino. So the preparation, I like working with bats, and that's what I demonstrated with in the video. But if you're interested in working with roving or tops, you can look at my wet felting tutorial and you can see me laying out roving. Either works really well. My personal preference actually is bats. Now, we have a question here from, I'm not sure that I'm going to pronounce this correctly, but it might be Gitta, about viscose. So I have not personally Nuno felted with viscose. So I'm looking at a woven fabric when I'm Nuno felting, not a knit or a jersey fabric. So I'm looking at a woven fabric. So what I would say about viscose, if there's an open weave viscose that you have access to, by all means try it. But I have not personally felted with that, so I cannot give you my personal experience on that, I'm afraid. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget you can subscribe to the channel or hit the like key, the like button, and you'll be kept informed of future tutorials, etc., and question and answer sections. So the fabric, I recommend silk, cotton gauze, any open weave. The fiber, if you're going to make wearable garments or scarves, I recommend merino, but you can try any fiber that you like. And you might be wondering then how to select the colors or what colors to combine when you're felting. I have a separate video showing how I was selecting some different colors when I was making a Nuno felting project. But what I like to do is I'm a real believer in upcycling and in reusing things where possible. So I love going to charity shops, thrift stores, op shops, whatever you choose to call them. And I'm always looking out for silk garments and things that I might be able to either eco print, because that's really my biggest passion, or that I might be able to dismantle for wet felting. And so I often get really funky patterned silk. Now, it may not be something I would ever choose to wear, but it's wonderful when you combine it with plain fabric and one color of wool. So my biggest tip is to think about watercolors. So if you are using, if you have some watercolors, if you have red and you add white to the red, that's going to make it pink. And if you keep adding more and more white, it's going to dilute the color. It gets paler and paler. Whereas if you add black, it gets darker. Or if you don't, if you added hot orange, it stays pretty much the same. So what I like to do is I like to choose a patterned fabric that I'm going to print, that I'm going to combine in my Nuno felted piece. And then I might choose some plain silk in the same color palette as, picking up some of the tones from the patterned fabric. And then I select either black or a strong color. It could be a hot red or a purple or an orange. I select a strong color from the patterned fabric, and that's the color that I ultimately use to create my piece of felt, because I want to enhance and intensify the colors. I don't want to use natural white or a creamy white or a very pale color, even though you might think it's going to look nice, but that actually just makes everything a lot paler. So I recommend a darker color. So then you can choose embellishing fibers, or you can work without embellishing fibers. So many pieces of my Nuno felt, particularly at the beginning, I didn't use any embellishing fibers. And if you're choosing to Nuno felt and then eco print, I recommend using a white silk, a natural creamy white wool, and then I recommend that you use cellulose embellishing fibers. So something that's plant-based rather than animal-based. Whereas if you're Nuno felting in color, I love to use silk. But the thing about using silk fibers as embellishing fibers, if you intend to eco print, is that the silk absorbs the color so well that often you can't see the embellishing fibers on the surface afterwards. So that's just a tip for you if you're interested in eco printing with Nuno felt. I recommend in that case you use cellulose embellishing fibers. Now, in fact, I have a piece here. Let me just add this to the stream. So this here is a Nuno felt scarf, and I hope you can see there's a sort of a tracery of white fibers coming down along the length of that piece. So that is a Nuno felt scarf, and that was printed using some large eucalyptus leaves and onion skins. But I had cellulose fiber, I had bamboo fiber as my embellishing fiber, so that fiber stands out in the finished piece. So that's just a tip for you. So you can also, with experience, embellish both sides of your fabric. So if you have more experience, this is for you. If you have less experience, maybe close your ears for a minute. But if you have more experience, what I actually sometimes do is I will lay embellishing fibers on my bubble wrap if I'm working on bubble wrap. So the bubbles facing up, I lay the embellishing fibers down. Then I roll my length of fabric on top of the embellishing fibers. Then I lay out my wool. Then I lay out my next lot of embellishing fibers. So I've now got embellishing fibers, silk, wool, embellishing fibers. So there's embellishing fibers on both sides of the piece. And when the wool fiber migrates through the silk fabric, enough tips of that wool fiber will come through that they combine with the embellishing fibers on the other side. And that can lead to very, very interesting effects. So how do you lay out your Nuno Felt? Exactly as you might imagine, very, very similarly to regular wet felt. So I like to work on bubble wrap, and I try not to use plastic in my practice wherever possible. And I do have some other mats I can use, or bamboo mats. But honestly, working on bubble wrap and reusing the bubble wrap multiple times, it's the best way of Nuno felting in my experience when you're starting. And it's, you know, you can reuse the bubble wrap multiple times. Just try not to burst the bubbles. So I would lay my length of fabric on the bubble wrap. Let's just assume we're making a scarf. I'd lay the length of fabric on the bubble wrap. No need to have rolled edges, just any piece of silk with a little bit of a torn edge, just tear it down rather than cutting it. Then I would lay a fine, even layer of fiber around the outside of the piece, and then I would infill with fiber. If you want more texture, just don't put the wool everywhere. If you want very even texture, just lay out one very fine layer of wool exactly the same way as you would if you are eco printing, or sorry, if you are wet felting regularly. Now I'm just going to add one image to the screen for a minute. So this here, if you just look at this particular piece in the background, you can ignore the text if you want. That's a piece of Nuno Felt, and I printed it. It's one piece of felt, but one side has got all that texture that you can see in the bottom of the image. And the other side is just the wool side, but it's also got some embellishing fibers. So this was an even layout of wool, and that's why the silk side, which is at the bottom of the piece, I just folded it over so you could see the two together. That's why it's got such an even sort of crinkling thing. Whereas if I didn't have an even layer of fiber behind the silk fabric, that would be even more textured. And this particular one here, this is a very, very textured Nuno Felt skirt. So this had actually 14 mame silk, and I overlapped that silk a few times. So it was going through multiple layers of a heavy silk. But in fact, I replaced the rubbing and the rolling for that particular piece I used a tumble dryer method, which is something I will share later on in a future video on YouTube. That's really fantastic if you have any health issues or you want to work with much thicker fabric. But when I'm working by hand, I would always stick with the lower mame pieces. So I'm just seeing, are there any? Oh, yes, questions. Yes. So please don't forget, if you have a question, as this Facebook user has done, they've put the question marks at the beginning and the end. That really highlights it, and I can pick that out. And one other note, if I look at Pat, for example, who's saying hi from Yellowknife. Hi, Pat. So Pat, you can see her Facebook profile there. If it comes up and it says Facebook user, the next time I do a live stream, before it starts, if you look up at the top of your screen, you will see on Facebook, if you join via Facebook, you will see where it says allow Facebook to or StreamYard to access your profile. And if you approve that, we can then see your face, and I also get to see your name. So it's when you say small or large bubble, if you mean by large the bubble that's about that size, hang on, can you see? Yep. That's way too large. So the regular bubble wrap, the very, very tiny, tiny small bubble wrap would also work. But the regular bubble wrap that is the most often used, it's certainly the one that in Ireland and England we would see 95% of the time. That is the best to use. I wouldn't recommend the big bubbles at all for Nuno felting. Some people also like to use solar pool cover. So again, that would be a similar size to the bubble wrap that I use, but I personally don't enjoy using that. I find it too stiff, but it would be possible to use that. So I laid out on bubble wrap. I use an olive oil soap, but any gentle soap is good. I don't use something like a Dawn washing up liquid. because I find it's really, really tough on your hands. And then I feel it's also going to be tough on the wool fiber. So I like to use an olive oil or a coconut oil or a goat's milk soap, something very gentle, or a soap like Dr. Bonner's also works really well. And with Nuno Felt, you need to be careful when you are adding your soap and water. Don't flood the piece, because you're laying a very fine layer of fiber, and that will just float off the silk fabric or the cotton fabric if you add too much water. It's always easy enough to add a little more water, but it's not so easy to remove water. Now, a question I get asked very often is how many rolls, when you have your piece laid out and you've given it a little rub, you've got your second layer of bubble wrap on top and it's rolled up, how long to roll your piece for before you move on to the next stage, which is throwing the piece? Well, I would say there's absolutely no way for me to tell you exactly. I mean, sometimes in books it says, 200, 300, 500. What I find is you've got to develop an eye for what's happening, and you've got to develop a feel, and it's an emotion almost when you're felting. So take your time at the beginning, lay out your piece. Again, you can look at my step-by-step video and see that whole process. And then I like to rub on top of the top layer of bubble wrap. I like to rub it, peel the bubble wrap off, reposition it, turn it over, and do that a little before I start to roll. And then once I start to roll, I roll for maybe 30, 50, 20, I open it, I reposition the bubbles, and I keep going. And then I start to roll for a little bit longer, but I never would do 300 or 400 rolls. I always keep opening and checking and repositioning the bubble wrap. And I keep rubbing and rolling until I see the tips of the wool fibers have migrated through the silk fabric or the cotton fabric. And I can clearly see tiny little tips on top of the fabric. And at that stage, I move on to the throwing process. But probably my biggest tip, if you're a novice felt maker, is if you're asking yourself, is it ready to throw? If you have to ask yourself, am I ready to throw? I would say you are not ready to throw. You're always better giving it another 10 minutes of rolling before you throw it, because if you throw it too soon, what will happen is you'll be aggressive, and that wool fiber will just sort of pull away from the silk, and the little tips that are coming through will come away from your silk or your cotton gauze or whatever, and the piece will disintegrate. And at that stage, you've had it. It's too late to do anything about it. So I would say if you're not 100% sure, just keep going. And then what happens is you scrunch up your piece of fabric very, very carefully, always with the wool fiber on the inside of the package and the fabric on the outside. And then you sort of drop it on your table and you rotate it a little bit and you drop it a few times and then you open it up. And what you need to watch out for is that at the edge of the scarf, that the edge hasn't folded over a little bit, or the I'm using scarf, but it could be a curtain, it could be anything, because sometimes the edge will curl over, so you might have to peel that back. And you just keep checking, adding soap and water, and make sure your piece is soapy when you are throwing it. And then when it's really shrunk nicely, you can also choose to finish the Nuno Felt by rubbing the edges against your bubble wrap, but then you give it a really good wash to remove all the soap. Some people recommend a vinegar rinse. I don't personally do that myself, but some people do. They say that helps bring shine out in the silk. I don't do that myself. But what I do is I then put it in the spin cycle of my washing machine if I'm working on a very big piece. But if I'm working on a smaller piece, I would put it into a salad spinner, one of the ones that you turn the handle on the top. And that just gets the excess water, your rinsing water, out of your felt. And at that stage, I just stretch it to shape and I iron it on both sides of the fabric. And you might say to yourself, but is that going to lose the texture? And my answer is no. So you can see here, there's plenty of texture in that piece. I didn't lose any texture, and that was ironed on both sides. And this one here was ironed I don't unfortunately have a close-up of that skirt, but that has got really, really, really heavy texture, and that was ironed on both sides of the felt. So I hope that's answered the questions that have come in to me during the week. But if you have any questions about Nuno felting, now is the time to drop them in the comment section, please, and I will answer them. Maybe I already have answered them. I actually have a book here that I do recommend, my all-time favorite felting book. And this is Felt to Stitch by Sheila Smith. And actually, she's got some really nice things in here. This is sort of a cotton gauze. She's just got circles of wool. There's nothing to say that with Nuno Felt, you have to cover the whole piece. Here's another really nice piece that she's done. She's just done a grid. And you can see around the outside, these sort of scalloped edges. That's because she hasn't got fiber all around the outside edge of that piece. So Felt to Stitch by Sheila Smith, that's a book I highly recommend if you're new to felt making. And even as an experienced felt maker, that would be the book I would be most likely to go back to and just reread sections of. So I think, thank you very much for your patience. I can't see any comments coming in. So if you've enjoyed this, as I say, there will be plenty more videos coming up. Next week, I'm actually going to have a question and answer session about eco printing in the dirty pot. That's creating color, that's adding color onto your pieces without using a traditional powdered mordant. So if you're interested in that, I'll be having that next week. And also I have a Facebook group. So if you look at Facebook.com/groups/Nicola Brown, that's all about people who are interested in wet felting as a technique and also in eco printing without powdered mordants. So maybe some of you might join me over there. And okay, so here we have questions. Okay, so let's just see. So don't forget, drop questions. So Lydia, from making garments, would I felt first and cut out and sew? Okay. So for making garments, would you felt first and then cut out and sew, calculate the shrinkage, make the garment larger? Okay, so it depends, Lydia, on what I am doing. But normally, one of the beauties of felt is that you don't have to sew. And so in that case, for example, this skirt here, I made a template for the skirt, and then, you know, I would have done samples. I would have worked out shrinkage to a degree. I'm not the most precise. And then I felted that piece, and that was made seamlessly. But also, if you follow me on Instagram, I posted an image just before the live stream started, and it was of a vest, a reversible vest. And that particular vest, actually, I had made a skirt previously, a Nuno Felt skirt, and I just wasn't wearing it. So I cut up the patterned fabric of the Nuno Felt skirt, and I used that for one side of the garment. So you can do both, but you need to be aware that making garments, seamless garments, there are many people who specialize in making them. Charity Vandermeer is one person, for example, Charlotte Buch in Denmark. Many people. It's not something I specialize in, but you need to scale up dramatically if you want soft and fluid clothing. So it requires much more space. Whereas if you make yardage, you can just make rectangles of fabric and then cut that up and use that for sewing. Somebody's saying the best way to find my video on Nuno Felt. Yes, so when this live stream ends, I will pin a link to the Nuno Felting video under the video description. So I can't actually add it now because there are only so many things I can do multitasking. I would need to copy the link from somewhere else, and I don't want to work on the computer while I'm chatting to you. So as soon as this is over, I will put the link to the Nuno Felting video in the video description, and you can find it there. Or my channel is I'm not sure. Okay, so you're probably watching this on Facebook. So if you're on Facebook, you're obviously either watching it on my business page or you're watching it in my Facebook group. The link to the Nuno Felting video is actually already in both of those groups, so you should be able to find it there as well. Okay, so thank you, everybody. I see some thank yous coming in. Thank you all so much. So any final questions, or are you happy that we call it quits for tonight? And I hope to see you next week for a live stream, eco printing in the dirty pot, questions and answers, and any more questions that come in relation to Nuno Felting. If you are watching this on the replay, please just drop them as a comment and I will answer them for you. Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Over and out from Clasheen.